Welcome, everyone, uh, to History Matters, and so does coffee. As promised, I waited yesterday. Actually, normally I'm apologetic for not figuring out what we're going to talk about until Thursday at a late time. But yesterday I wanted to wait until after the hearing to figure out what we were going to talk about, which made perfect sense. And so we are going to talk about witnessing history and what that means. And I'll explain more about that in a few minutes. But before I do that, I am going to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who is at an event and has snuck into a ballroom to be here for us. So I just need to acknowledge that, Annie, for everyone who is gathered here. And she will explain the rules of the game.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History Project, and I am delighted to be with you. And we are illegally sneaking in and using a space that we did not have permission. So I don't know if I will be here the whole time, because if I get caught, we might get kicked out, but that's what makes it fun. But every week we gather here. We have a wonderful community. If you are new, we love it for you to let us know. We'd love you to tell us where you're logging in from. That's always fun. In the chat, there's a lot going down the chat, so make sure you switched it to everyone so that it's not just us that are seeing your wonderful messages. But if you have questions, and this is such a rich topic today, witnessing history. So if you have questions, you've got to put those in the Q&A, because in about a half an hour, we will respond to your questions, but we only look for the ones that you put in the Q&A. So I'm excited to hear about this topic. So we're ready to go, I think.
Excellent. And I will add one or two things, and that is, if there are folks who are here and are new, please do tell us that you're here for the first time or one of the first times that you've been here, because the History Matters community is really a community. So folks would like to welcome you. So please do mention in chat if you are new to History Matters. And I think I can launch into the, oh, I know the other thing I was going to mention. I gather, and Annie can correct me, that there is bingo possible this week again for anyone who is new to the History Matters community. They invented bingo centered on our conversations, in part because I say some words really, really predictably, like, for example, contingency. So I just gave everyone like a free space on bingo. But at any rate, someone can say in chat how to get access to the bingo card. I do not know what number episode this is. Actually, I just saw someone ask that. 132, our 132nd straight episode. Man, someday we're going to be saying the 1050th. I can't even imagine. At any rate, what I do want to talk about today, and obviously it was inspired by some of the events of yesterday, was the idea of witnessing history. Now, I realize, and as I came up with this topic, you know, in a certain way, in recent years, it feels as though, for good reason, we are witnessing history all the time, right? It sort of feels like within any nanosecond at a given moment, it's like, oh, this hasn't happened before. Oh, this has happened before, but never quite in this way. Oh, what's going to happen now? It gets us back to contingency. We live in strange times, right? There have been other moments that are as fraught as the current moment is, but we're at a particularly high speed version of history is happening all around us all the time. And I talk about all the time, you know, thinking about the current moment. I've mentioned before here and on Twitter, keeping a journal of some kind, marking things down as they're happening, because some of what we're going through now is so unique and so distinctive, just on a pandemic level, above and beyond the politics. There's so much going on right now, and we will forget a lot of what we're experiencing right now, particularly in some ways, although I'm going to almost contradict myself in a moment, but some of the feelings or the realities of what we're going through, you know, like I always use this as my example, but how difficult it was for me to get food in New York City during the pandemic, when the food stores were basically closed and you had to order online, but there were no slots open online. And so I would have to wait until 1 a.m. when certain slots would open and then pounce and then decide what foods to ask for, because some of them would be sold out by the time it was time for me to get the groceries, and the amount of time and effort I put into figuring out how to get food. I will remember that because I've mentioned it too often here on History Matters, but that's the sort of thing and the sort of reality, and in a sense, also the sort of feeling. It wasn't panic, but it was like anxiety, right? About getting my food in some way during the pandemic, that we easily and readily forget. So I've been talking about witnessing history and recording the history of our times for ourselves, and of course, in doing so, for future people to look on and help them better understand what we're going through. But I think there are also specific moments, specific events that are more specific than we live in, crazy times. We live in pandemic times, whatever the sort of broad topic that we might use to define a historic moment. Sometimes there are moments that, and a moment in this case, I mean literally a moment, that captures something distinctive about the moment that we're in. And maybe sometimes it's a turning point moment, or it's a particularly revealing moment, or it's a somehow symbolic moment, or a landmark moment, or a moment that alters in some very, maybe concrete isn't the right word, but very specific way, a worldview. Right? There are moments that stand out even in history-making times that we know on a certain level we are witnessing history. And I will say at the outset, tragedies fall into that category, but I'm actually talking beyond that in what I want to talk about today. So there are, tragedies stand out, and for a good number of reasons, and they certainly count as witnessing history. But what I want to talk about today is moments that seem literally history making. In some way, that we, on a different level of our thinking, or a different level of our consciousness, understand that something is happening here in a different way, and that for one reason or another, we can feel that. We can feel that in our guts. We kind of have a, I don't know if I've ever actually uttered the phrase spidey sense, but have a sense, right? A sort of gut feeling that something that's going on here is like a moment that has to be recognized. And many of us, even if you're not talking in a general way about, problematic presidencies and pandemics, there have been any number of such moments in recent times. And, the easiest one, given the hearing yesterday, is January 6th, right? There's no question that anyone seeing that happen knew as it was happening that we were witnessing history, and we also didn't know what it meant or what would happen. I'm going to come back to January 6th because who was I talking? Oh, I was at an event yesterday and I was talking to people about how I will never forget what that felt like. Right? I will never forget what that felt like. And that's related to what I want to talk about today. What struck me about this, and what first sort of got me on this trail years ago, actually, but thinking about moments that you recognize as they're happening in some way or another are history, has to do with my American Revolution lecture course. And I was talking about the early years of the revolution. And in casting about and looking for things, I just stumbled across a number of people thinking about Lexington and Concord, which, it's so familiar to us as part of the opening of the revolution that it's almost like a rote phrase, like blah, 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 Paul Revere, Lexington and Concord. But what I found was people essentially remembering precisely where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news of what had happened at Lexington and Concord. And what shocked them was that, in a sense, their own government, the British government, was shooting at British subjects and had killed some, right? That it was a moment for American colonists that stood out. And they remembered, I was in the field when I heard this, or I was cooking a meal when I heard this, whatever it is that they were saying, they remembered the moment that they heard that, and it stood out for them and it stayed with them, because that was a moment that they understood it was big. They understood the implications were enormous. They understood it. Suddenly they didn't know what would happen next. And it changed the realm of the possible in some ways for them. It's not something they thought about before. This was their government. I mean, not obviously their colonial government, but still their government, the king's troops, shooting at British subjects. So that, finding that and then lecturing about that, that resonated with me in a powerful way, and led me, and over the years I have in any number of ways and any number of different times had these moments when I know that I'm witnessing history, and many of you I'm sure can name these too. As a historian, there's like an extra added dimension to that, because as a historian you're witnessing history, so then you suddenly have to reckon with it in a different kind of a way. Now that's not necessarily a purely modern awareness. One of the things I jotted down when I was trying to think about past moments that had a historical sensibility to them that people recognized in the moment they were witnessing history, and this will make perfect sense coming from me, but I thought about the first paragraph of the first Federalist essay, and I meant to grab it and have it in front of me so that I could actually read it, which I forgot to do, but I will paraphrase it. Towards the middle of that first paragraph of the first Federalist essay, Hamilton essentially says that we are doing something here, the American experiment, right? We are determining for all time whether it's possible to create governments for nations from deliberation, debate, and choice, or whether we are forever destined to create governments based on accident and force. And a wrong move in the part that we act now may deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind. What he's saying there in far more eloquent words than I just offered you is we're here trying to put together the Constitution, the government, a new government, and we're trying to do it through deliberation, and have people ratify things and think about things and be in a room, debate and compromise. That's not normally how nations are born. That's not typical, and particularly in a world of monarchies, as the world was at that time. That paragraph, and I read it all the time. I just read it to my seminar Tuesday, actually. I read it all the time because it essentially captures something about that moment, that there was an awareness, and it wasn't just the 10 elite guys in a room who had this awareness. There was an awareness that something that was going on in this new country, in the United States, was distinctive, was different, and it was something to watch. It was making history in some way. The question was, would it be making history in a good way or in a bad way? And no one knew, but I've talked many times before on History Matters about, again, contingency, the degree to which the founding wasn't the founding, all capital letters at the time, and in which people understood at the time that they were engaging in some kind of an experiment in government, and they didn't know what would happen. Now, I actually made a note to myself here, as though I'm going to forget it. It's always worth noting when you're quoting or citing the Federalist essays that they are not and were never intended to be objective. So on the one hand, I think that Hamilton in that paragraph is absolutely reflecting something that was in the air at the time, in the ethos of the time. On the other hand, he's also trying to appeal to an audience to get them to understand the importance of what they did at the Federal Convention and the importance of ratifying the resulting document. The Federalist essays are, as I say to my students, a pitch, a commercial advertisement for the Constitution. It's always important to remember that. But even so, those sentences capture something of this awareness that we're, deciding for all time. This is a moment that might really matter, is basically what he was saying. And there have been any number of moments over the years where even in the moment, I've realized that I was witnessing something distinctive and sometimes even in ways not necessarily good, and I'll come back to that momentarily, I realize I'm getting a sense of something, a sensibility about something that I understood intellectually before. I lecture about it, I write about it, it appears in my books, but that I didn't have a gut understanding of before. I didn't have the emotions that go along with it before. One example of that I remember, and it might be the first moment that I was thinking along these lines, actually, was when former President Clinton was impeached. The reason that I remembered that as a distinctive moment isn't because, oh, there was an impeachment, isn't that historic? What stood out to me about that was a moment, and I didn't have time in preparing for this episode to go back and find it. There was a moment in which that the House and the Senate, the Joint Committee trying to figure out what to do, they were trying to figure out, like, literally how to do what they were doing. Like there was discussion, where do they meet? How do they meet? How do they join together? Who's walking where? There was a discussion about the literally ground level logistics of an impeachment. What do we do? Where do we walk? How do we do this? We haven't done this before. It hasn't happened all that often. And what stood out to me at the time, and clearly has stayed with me, I write as an early American historian, I write about and spend a lot of time in a moment when people were inventing procedures, processes, governments, right? They were in the process of very self-consciously creating a political process and then thinking about the implications. And what I was watching members of Congress try and figure out the logistics, just the basic logistics of how do you impeach a president? Where do you stand? How do we do this? It gave me this little glimmer of the sensibility of inventing what to be an important political moment or an important political process on a level beyond conceptualizing it, but on actually a level of actually bringing it to life. That moment stood out to me because I suddenly had this gut understanding of, look at this, they're improvising. Of course they're improvising. They haven't done this before, but emotionally, I had a slightly different understanding of the gut reality of some of the moments that I study in early America. Many more of these kinds of moments happening all the time, and to people at the time, many of them had much greater stakes because, as I've said many times before, many people in the founding era, elite and otherwise, thought that, if you make some dumb choices, a handful of dumb choices, maybe one really dumb choice, and the whole thing collapses. They had that sensibility at the time, and now I kind of understood it a little better. September 11th, the original September 11th, did the same thing for me, and I actually wrote an essay about it that maybe it was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I can't even remember where, but I wrote an essay in which I said, obviously, there's no question as it was unfolding that we were watching not just a tragedy, but we were watching on some level history happening. But what stood out for me and what I wrote about was suddenly, in an emotional way, in a gut level way, I understood vulnerability, American vulnerability, as I hadn't understood it before. Now, I, again, have spent decades writing about a moment when the United States was, as I jokingly say in some of my classes, a fly speck on the windshield of the world, right? That it was nothing. It was, it was interesting. Look at what's going on there in North America. Wonder what'll happen with it, right? It was vulnerable. It didn't really have any power at all. It was constantly trying to figure out how to maneuver through this world of very powerful, very old empires of one kind or another. But on September 11th, what we experienced, that what I thought about was that with that event, as it was unfolding, I suddenly felt vulnerable as an American in a way that I hadn't before. And I suddenly understood the vulnerability of the United States on a world level in a gut way beyond what I had understood before. And I understood also as a historian immediately the way in which that was giving me this little glimmer of some kind of gut understanding of the period that I write about and have written about for decades. The vulnerability and the sense that the world is out there, and who are we and what can we do to protect ourselves, and can we protect ourselves, and what does it mean about the future? All of those questions that in your normal life before that point, you didn't necessarily think about on a national level, and suddenly we all were thinking about it. That made me think about just having a core visceral understanding of what it meant to be in such a moment. And yesterday, several of you in the comments already in the chat function here mentioned hashtag HATH, historians at the hearings, in which historians, and I'm one of them, and Heather Cox Richardson, my podcast partner, is another one, live tweet along with the hearings, in part to comment as historians on the significance of what's happening, in part to record the significance of what's happening, to just get it out there, but to have historians sort of commenting on that moment. And yesterday, in the moment when it became clear before it happened that the January 6th committee was going to subpoena the president, I went on Twitter and I said, folks, if you're not watching the hearing, beam in now, because they are coming up on a moment. It's very clear. And you could tell in the rhetoric that was coming at the end, in the closing of yesterday's hearing, you could see them leading up to it. And I said, it's coming now. They're going to subpoena former President Trump, and you should tune in to see this, in part because it is a historic moment, but also in part, and this is more of what I'm getting at today, in part because it captures so many things about this current moment, above and beyond the fact that it's historic to see a president subpoenaed. Not the first time it's happened, hasn't happened a lot, but it's happened before. But to see that in this current moment, and to be in the moment, be aware that it's happening, and think about the implications, then it becomes not just something that is important for you to witness and understand as an American, but it becomes a potential teaching moment about the times that we're in. Because if I'm sure many of you were thinking along the lines of what I was thinking as that was unfolding, and I saw people commenting about this all over the place, in social media and otherwise yesterday as this was unfolding, and then as I went on Twitter and commented that this is a moment you should be watching and thinking about. So on the one hand, the committee apparently decided to do this during the hearing in part because they wanted it to be part of the public record. They wanted to do it in front of a national audience. They also asked for a roll call vote. So it wasn't just the committee says we are going to do this. They had every individual on the committee individually say, yes, I think we should subpoena the president again, registering that for the historical record, registering that for history. But what we were watching was, on the one hand, a moment of improvisation at a time of frantic and often highly problematic political improvisation. So you were watching people trying to decide what to do. You were individually, I'm sure, thinking to yourself, why does this matter? Like, will the former president listen to this? Will it matter at all? Will he go? Will he abide by it? Does it matter? They just did this. Does it matter? And the fact that you're asking that question, that's pretty remarkable. And that tells you something about the moment that we're in. So at the same time that we can say, wow, that's historic, a president's being subpoenaed, to me, in a sense, what's more interesting and more distinctive and more important in the witnessing of that history is the way in which you, and certainly I, responded, and what that says about the moment, the way that it captures the sort of ongoing sense of crisis, the way it captures the fragility of our political system at this given moment, that, he might not accord by it. He might not, follow that at all, congressional subpoena. And will anything happen if he doesn't? The fact that we're asking those questions tells you so much about this moment and the fragility of our political system at this moment and the things now as Americans that we're kind of taking for granted. Oh, of course the system won't work now in that way. And what does that mean? We don't know. The living through that moment and being able to step outside of yourself beyond saying, this is history, and asking, what does this moment mean? Particularly given that I know in my gut it's historic. What does my reaction mean? What does this moment mean? And what does it reveal specifically about the moment that we're in? What does it suggest? In a sense, thinking in that way, stepping a little bit outside of yourself to think about yourself, thinking about that moment, witnessing that moment, is a powerful kind of personal lesson in the fragility and, in a sense, inherent dangerousness of the moment that we're in. The fact that that's immediate, it happens all the time, and that something pretty fundamental, subpoenaing a president and assuming that the president will abide by the subpoena, and if he doesn't, what then? That captures so much about this moment, and the ways in which, never mind contingency, one of my favorite words, but the ways in which there are so many fundamental questions being asked now, and that we need to be asking about the democratic political process, about our constitutional process, about the ways in which they function, about the ways in which they're supposed to function, and what we do when they're being misused or ignored. Being in that moment yesterday, watching that moment in the hearing, and thinking about what it means that you understand that it's historic, it tells you, it teaches you a lot about the moment that you're in, that you probably in your gut already understand much of it, but haven't thought about it, haven't given it words, and haven't recognized it in a way that is really important right now. It's vitally important right now to think about what's happening around us in a broader, larger sense than the immediacy and urgency of the current absolute minute that we're in. We have to be thinking on multiple levels as Americans right now. We have to be. We have to, on the one hand, think about immediate dangers, think about urgency, think about what might need to be done right now in the midst of an ongoing crisis. We also need to be able to stand back and think about the repercussions and implications and outcomes that are possible based on what we're witnessing, based on what we might do or not do. We have to think about the here and now, and we have to think about the unfolding. We have to think in a complicated way about the history that we're witnessing now as Americans. If we don't, we are literally just witnesses. We have to witness things in a more complicated way so that we can be actors as well, because we live in a time when the preservation of democracy requires action, requires participation, requires a savvy understanding of the moment and what protecting the future of democracy might require now. So in a way, sort of not in a way that I intended when I thought of today's subject, at the moment, part of the importance of witnessing history is being aware that you should be doing more than just witnessing it, but that you should be aware of the fact that you're witnessing history and should be thinking constantly about the implications and lessons, immediate important lessons that we can and should be pulling from the events that we're seeing, and that we should be processing. What can happen next for better and worse? And how can we act on that, the better and worse that we can envision? How can we act on that to make things better, to improve from the moment that we're in, to push towards away from this sort of sense of a political abyss and towards something more in line with a safe, preserved, recognized, and respected democratic process? Okay, I'm 1 minute over. So okay, I will stop there. I do. Oh, no one start. Yeah, mug. I was going to say no one. I was about to talk about the mug before anyone mentioned the word bug. Again, if there's someone who is here and is new to History Matters for 132 weeks in one way, I know, isn't that shocking, Annie? For 100 for
A lot of
100
math for me.
Pardon?
That's a lot of math for me.
It's we, in one way or another, I have come at the end of every episode with a mug that in some way thematically links with whatever we're talking about. I do not have 132 mugs, I promise. Definitely a lot of repeat performances. But remarkably, probably partly because I'm being really creative and stretching the linking of these mugs to what we're talking about. At any rate, the mug I picked today has to do with the process of witnessing history and explaining what you're witnessing. And it is this mug. I turn coffee into books. This is the process of witnessing and then understanding and interpreting history in a mug.
That's a good one. A big one too. That's my favorite size mug. Those ones that you can like, they're really 2 cups of coffee.
They are. I know, although I made so much coffee. I don't know what this means this morning. I was like, wow, I maybe made too much for my mug, which doesn't often happen. But at any rate,
That's a great,
my mug for the day. Okay.
that's a good one.
So
Mary Beth says she turned coffee into clothing as a knitter.
I just saw that on the bottom of the screen, and I totally understand that. I'm going to hold this up again because someone always asks me to hold it up again. I guess Carolee has to take a
Carolee
photo.
takes pictures and puts them up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Carolee, we need to get a mug that says, I turn history into lesson plans or something like that. We can make it for the conference. when we
Yeah,
go to
there could be a fine mug
Mhm.
made with this idea. That's true.
Yep, I like that. Okay, we do have questions. Are you ready? Let me finish your coffee first. Go ahead and finish
No,
that.
I got plenty. So let's
Okay.
go.
Okay. The first one comes from our friend Dave. Dave asked, will the moments of January 6th or the upcoming midterm elections or even the general election of 2024 be considered historic? Is labeling that what is historic up to the future historians or those that are living the present time?
Oh, interesting. You guys, man,
You're on it. You're on it.
for like more than 1 week, you've been coming with these questions, and particularly the first one out of the gate. Then I'm going to give you a really historian answer. Both. I do think along the lines of what I just said in my comments, we need to understand that these are historic moments in the moment for us, because I think that will help us interpret what's happening. But certainly as a historian, I'm constantly thinking about future historians, never mind future witnesses of various kinds way down the road, looking back and trying to understand what's going on now. But I automatically, as anything unfolds, I think to myself, probably not to a degree that I've actually processed until this moment. Like, what's the evidence? What's being preserved? What can people watch? What does it look like? How can they misunderstand it? What will future historians, what are the ways in which they'll look at this moment? What kind of evidence will they have? And what might they conclude? Some of it, what they'll be concluding, of course, being, who the heck knows, weird, probably seeming illogical, crazy conclusions, but still. So I do think on both levels, I think is along the lines of what I just said, it's vitally important for us to understand something that's unfolding now as, in a very real way, being historic, meaning big implications for the present, and what does that mean? But I think thinking about what the future will conclude about this moment and how that will shape the future, right? In the same ways that now we should be, and many of us are, looking back at American history in a broad way for good and bad, and using that broad understanding of the good and bad that has happened in our past to better understand how we got to our current moment. What's unfolding now will be serving that function for people down the road, whatever condition the world is in and whatever condition the United States will be in. What we're going through now will inform people in the future about the moment that they're in and how they got to where they are. And I think that's important too. The technology of our current moment complicates things in a good way, which means there's all, social media and TV and cable options and cell phones and, everything else. There are any number of ways now in which evidence is being churned out wildly. I always, as a largely late 18th, early 19th century historian, I'm very pleasantly immersed in a period where it's like there are limited sources. And sometimes that's beyond frustrating, particularly, if you're trying to write about anybody other than elite people, it's beyond frustrating. But there's a small universe within which you're digging and putting pieces together. Who knows what people can conclude based on the ocean of kinds of evidence and the ways in which, and we've talked about this in recent weeks too, right? The ways in which, what are the facts? Like what's real, what's being created, what's being edited together. But still, regardless, I think present and future historical significance is vitally important to think about as we're going through what we're going through.
Yeah, the technology piece, there's just so much, that we didn't have, like when you think about a Watergate or even the Challenger, that, yeah. And kids, what I loved was Josh pointed out that he's trying to document all this now because his kids are little, but someday they're going to have questions. And I was just like, oh, Josh, if every parent would do that.
Yes. No, but that's so important,
It
and documenting it, not just what's happening, but your response as a parent, right? But your kids will never understand any better what's going on than having the parent, the formative person in their life, explain to them what it felt like and what it felt like with them there, right? The parent grappling with things while the kid is there, even if the kid isn't processing it, too young to process it. I hadn't thought about that, but that's also really huge.
Huge. All right, our friend Gloria has a great question. As always, it says, even January 6th is flawed as a witness. It depends on the media you're watching. Not every eyewitness account or not all eyewitness accounts flawed. And do we then analyze the emotions behind the events?
Well, I think, well, I'm a historian who's really interested in the emotions linked with politics. So part of my answer to that question is yes, we do. But we do, right? Because for several reasons. For one reason, some of the events and words and actions that we are seeing in the present are explicitly being spoken or acted to rouse emotion, right? We've talked about rage harvesting in the past. There are any number of ways in which getting us to feel a certain way in the current moment is part of the current moment. But I also think along the lines of colonists remembering what it felt like to hear about Lexington and Concord. I think, I said earlier that, I mentioned last night or the night before at an event that I will never forget what it felt like to watch January 6th unfold. I won't ever forget, but part of the significance of that to me is because of what those feelings were linked to, right? I mean, I remember the feelings, they were intense, but what I was thinking was, that's our capital. Like, this is our government. Look at what's happening here and the implications of this. And how can this be happening? How am I witnessing this? What does it suggest about the moment that we're in? How is this happening? So the emotions were, my emotions, like so many other people's, were huge, but they were huge emotions about what that moment suggested about the fragility or stability or survival of our basic democratic process and what it suggested about the state of American politics at the moment and what the state of politics might go on to be in the near future. So the emotion of that matters, I think, particularly given that when you're talking about historic events that represent major mind shifts or potentially major events, the emotion that goes along with feeling shocked that there might be massive change, that's an important emotion, right? That's registering what some of the significance of what you're witnessing might be. So I think the emotion is part of it. I think, Gloria, you're absolutely right. You can look in any number of different places and get a lot of different kinds of evidence. As a historian, speaking about the way that I study the past, when I'm studying the past, I don't go to only newspapers from one party, or only people on one side of a political issue, right? What I want to do is collect a broad swath of kinds of evidence and then evaluate, see what I can see what other people say they saw, see how they conflict or go along with each other, and then piece things together in a way that in the end I feel is as close as I can get to what actually happened. I mean, I think I've talked at some point before about piecing together a huge brawl in the House of Representatives. And of course, it was talked about all over the place, but no two accounts were the same. And sometimes like startlingly different. So I was looking at all kinds of newspapers, personal accounts, diaries, letters, every kind of thing, people of all kinds of politics claiming all kinds of things. And I had all of the evidence in front of me. And then I pieced together what it was clear had actually happened just based on concrete evidence, not based on someone's account of it, or what was physically possible in the room at a moment. And then tried to piece together what actually happened. And I came up with something. I think I mentioned recently when I brought this up that I went running down to the lobby of this building in New York to tell the doorman that I'd figured it out. Because they know me sitting up here like wrestling. I was like, I figured it out. I got it. But that's me as a historian thinking about 1858. But in a way, we should be thinking like historians about the present, and always asking questions, just like all of the people here who are teachers, and we spend all of our time trying to teach our students to evaluate evidence, right? To think about the sources of pieces of evidence, to understand the credibility of different sources of evidence, to understand the need to think about and not just accept what you see. As much as January 6th stands out, it's a good point, Gloria, that we still need to be historians in this moment of that moment, because it's so easy, partly given technology these days, to only see one thing or to misinterpret what one sees, or to have other people be misinterpreting or crafting what is seen, cutting things out, adding things in. In a sense, we all have to think like historians, even as we're living in the present.
I put a shameless plug in the chat. We just re-released the Valley of the Shadow. We rebuilt the whole website after 30 years. It was like a big thing this week, and it was the big centerpiece of our newsletter. And that was my first time using the technology to teach, right? Like Netscape was new. My third year teaching is when Netscape became a thing. And that was the first history digital thing I ever found. And I used it. And it's just weird now, like 30 years later, it still holds up. Like you were saying, like looking at newspapers, but diaries and journals and people's personal thoughts around any event. It's just so fascinating. Even now we've got better ways to harness that and digitize it and reorganize it. And Carol Leib said, now they're teaching 9/11 as history, right? The events of 9/11 are now considered history to the kids that we're teaching in this right now. Like none of the kids that are in school K-12 were alive on 9/11.
What's
right?
interesting then about that is, right, you can say, I remember, here's what it felt like. That, and just as we were saying before, to your own kids, that's so powerful.
Yeah.
Right. That's, and particularly to students who, if it's history, it's like way over here somewhere. It's like, just like we think about the founders on a pedestal as these like blocks of marble, oh, it's history. It's some concrete thing over here. And if you say, no, this is what it felt like, history becomes, it shakes students up. I remember being sitting in as a grad student in a course, like just sitting in the back of the room. It was an undergrad lecture course. And I can't even remember what the subject was, but the professor said, no one in this room was alive when President Kennedy was assassinated. And then he said, oh no, Joanna was alive when President Kennedy.
Oh, wow.
And the students all, like, you could see they were like,
right.
Oh,
right.
Like number one, like it happened and there's someone sitting here. And this is a long enough time ago. Like I didn't look ancient, right? I mean, not that I do now, but I was like relatively young. I was in my 30s. That shook them up, right? Suddenly it wasn't like capital letters history. It was, oh, this happened. And this person saw, they didn't think about the fact that I was like a wee little person, but still, it changed their understanding of history as being actual fact.
Mhm. Mary Beth said, and I thank you, Carolee, for correcting me. It was Mary Beth that said it's being taught as history now. And she said that she finds herself talking about it like she's become her parents, right? Like when her parents would say, when I was a kid, or back in the day, and now she finds herself in that, part of her life. And Matt said it was his fourth day teaching was 9/11. Can you imagine?
Matt,
Our Matt. Yeah.
our Matt.
Our Matt said it was his fourth day teaching was 9/11.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, we have a few more questions and I've only got a few more minutes left with y'all. So
Okay.
Bobby has a question. Bobby says, doesn't it undermine democracy to have the national news media poo-poo, her words, not mine, poo-poo the idea that 45 will ignore the subpoena? Many of my friends posted immediately asking why 45 doesn't have to comply with the rule of law.
Well, I think regardless of what the press said, people would assume that. Right. I mean, it's a question to ask, given all of the unprecedented or near unprecedented things we're going through. Regardless about what you think about the former president, we see it all the time. People ignoring subpoenas, refusing to comply. It was even brought up during the hearing, like we're still in the process of evaluating people who just refused to abide by our subpoenas. Like they're not going to necessarily get away with it. I don't think asking that question hurts democracy. I think the fact that we can ask it credibly shows us the risk of the moment that we're in, right? Because I do think, and I find myself still stunned that I can, I talk about Twitter far too often, that I could go on Twitter and say, in some way or another, folks, democracy is really in danger, and have people still deny it. We've lived through this before. Big deal. It'll be fine. For years now, I've been saying there are some ways in which this moment, the times we're in, are not like other crises. Yeah, we've had a lot of crises. They've been horrible crises. We've had a civil war. We are in a moment when our fundamental political process and the tenets that uphold it are being questioned, are being eroded. That's a whole different level of crisis, and that's that we're in a different kind of a moment. Every crisis is distinctive and unique in some ways. That's what's distinctive about this moment, is that the political process itself is in question, is being in some ways attacked, and we know that. So in this case, there are many ways in which I would say the press is not serving us well in this moment. As much as I appreciate reporters and the press and value it and understand its central importance, I also think that there are some things being said and some things not being said that are not serving us well as far as the American press at this moment. But I think asking the question or saying maybe the former president won't abide by this, I don't know if that in and of itself, I would say, threatens democracy. I think it exposes the nature of how democracy is faring in the United States, and the fact that it's in danger, and we need to think about it.
Yeah. All right. We have a question from Mary Beth. Did the founder folk believe they were making history at the time, or just doing something really important?
Well, initially, more the latter, right? Initially, they understood that what they were doing was really important. That said, and at a certain point later in time, they understood that whatever happened with the American experiment, that they had made history. It's like New Hampshire congressman in the early 19th century, William Plumer, who says, I'm going to interview people who were here and who helped with the actual creation of the first 10 years of the government. I'm going to interview them so that they could talk about what happened, because we don't have a history of the creation of the government. And, this happened. So I think people understood at a certain point that they were making history, but that generation of people, again, particularly we're talking now about elite men, but I think this extends beyond them. Elite men specifically were educated reading things like Plutarch's Lives of the Great Greeks and Romans. And what Plutarch taught was that the absolute greatest thing you could do was to be a statesman, and even better, to be a statesman who helps to create a nation. The founding generation were people who were educated to understand the significance of the moment that they were in, and said that a lot. Can you believe, like, we're alive at this moment? So they had a historical sensibility, and there are books about this, actually, about the historical sensibility of the time, that people understood in some way or another that they were making history. They didn't necessarily know what the outcome of that history would be. So they very much assumed that what they were doing was important. Not all the world thought that it was going to be as important as Americans assumed it was going to be, but still they were interested. But I think they, in different ways, thought that what was going on was history or historic. Yet another level of their thinking had to do with posterity, which is not quite historical thinking, but I think after a certain point, people who were in the process of politics in one way or another understood that their actions would shape posterity. They use that word all the time, right? That what they're doing, they have to think about posterity. They have to think about the legacy of what they're doing, because it will have an impact. That's a way in which the founding era stands out. It's just the degree to which people were very focused on legacy and posterity, not because they were wonderful and noble, but because they were constructing something, and they had to think about the long-term implications about what they were doing in a way that we, in the current time, we don't think that way, and politicians generally don't think that way at all. They think about the next election, right? Which is the opposite of posterity. They think about how many months till the next election.
All right, I think I only personally have room for time for one more question, but you guys can obviously, if Kathleen or Sarah or somebody want to field you a couple after that. But this will be my last one. This one comes from Sandra Peters. It says, I've seen people wondering why President Trump isn't indicted. Rumors that the Department of Justice may have evidence now and that they could. Is it fair to think about this historic moment as entangled with electoral politics? That whatever the government, the January 6th committee, the Department of Justice are calculating the impact of the upcoming election in timing the release of whatever information or evidence? And if that's true, how can we understand the subpoena?
I think that's a great question. And I think, yeah, we do have to think about the ways in which party politics in one way or another is shaping what people are doing, for sure. I think that's an excellent question. I actually just opened a Q&A here. Go here, which I never do, but I know Annie has to leave a few minutes early, so I'm like, woohoo! I'm dabbling in questions. I never do. I've never done before. That's an excellent question, because yeah, of course, particularly for all of the reasons I just named, that all of the things that are up in the air or endangered or in question or in this moment, and the ways in which everyone is hyper focused on the coming midterm election. Yeah, anything that happens has to have that as part of the calculation of it. If I were 100 years down the road looking back to this moment as a historian, of course I would say, okay, so here's the situation. X has happened, Y has happened, and they know that an election is coming in X number of weeks, and they understand the importance of the election. How do all of those factors shape what's going on? That doesn't mean that you dismiss something entirely. Oh, it's just for party politics, because I think that's as irresponsible as saying it has nothing to do with party politics. I think you have to process and think about reasons and implications, and then figure out different people, different ways, the degree to which and the ways in which different purposes and different motives shape things. But for sure, you can't be in this current moment and see political decisions being made and not think about the ways in which the current Democrat versus Republican struggle is shaping it, because it is. I mean, a lot of my early work is centered on the fact that an election is coming in 1800, 1796. What does that mean? How does that shape what people are doing? Of course it does. It's like my students asking, when we read political letters and things from the founding, from politicians, they will say, well, when do I know when to believe these politicians? Like, why do I read their letters and believe anything they say? They're politicians, right? And you could say, oh, don't believe anything, it's all party politics. Or you could say, oh, of course you believe them. They're, neither view is good. But then I teach them, well, who's it written to? What's the relationship between the person writing and the person being written to? How was it put in the mail? Was it dropped in the mail? Was it delivered hand to hand? And you think of all of the things that might shape how people will understand what's in that letter at the time. And then that can help you decide whether you believe a piece of evidence or not. I think we have to be thinking in the similar strategic kind of a way about what's happening around us now.
Yeah. And with that, I really do have to run.
Okay.
My meeting starts in 3 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much for letting me be here, at least for most of the time. Kathleen, please send me the full chat when you guys finish after the after party, and I'll get that up for everybody tonight, because I know people really depend on that. And if you don't mind, Kathleen, we'd love a list of all the questions, because we can't save those. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for beaming in while you're in the middle of an event.
Oh, always my pleasure. And I'll see you guys next Friday.
Yes. Yeah.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. Now I have Q&A open and we have like 1 or 2 minutes left. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So David says, one issue I find is when people overuse the term historical, unprecedented, and such when discussing events that end up being overshadowed by actual historical events. How do we avoid diluting the impact of the actual historical events? That's a really good question. And I have only said a few 100 million times the words matter, but they do. And very much when you say that something is unprecedented, nothing like this has ever happened before, if you state that in too absolute a way, you erase history, right? Unprecedented makes it sound like a moment is in isolation, and no moment is in isolation, right? Nothing that we're experiencing now is entirely in isolation. So, for example, with January 6th, when some people, even some historians, were saying, we haven't ever seen this kind of violence linked to politics in this way or whatever, unprecedented. It's like, well, no, let's talk about the fact that violence and politics have been arm in arm in one way or another in American history throughout its entirety, right? There are many ways in which things that we see at a given moment are very much a product of the past and an echo of the past and evidence of the past. So saying it's unprecedented or unique, I always tell my students not to say unique first only, because 99% of the time you're wrong. So it's an excellent point, David, that you shouldn't be throwing those words around, because they isolate the moment and they make it difficult to understand its all important historical context. On the other hand, I do think it's important to, when you're using those words, to be specific. So if you say about January 6th, this kind of an attack on the Capitol in this way, stands out or something, is whatever, there are aspects of what we're experiencing that in that sense are historic or historical. 18th century people like to add on the ickles to the end of everything. It's important to use those words sometimes, but you're right, to make sure that they're not being diluted. I think you have to be specific about what you're talking about, and you always have to make it clear the ways in which the past readily links with this moment, or the ways in which what's happening now is a reflection of the past or echoes what happened in the past. To understand our current moment, we can't understand our current moment without understanding what got us here, and without understanding the traditions that shape what we as Americans think is possible or not. So anyway, it's an excellent question. I would happily keep going, but we are at 11:01. So let me close this. We are at 11:01. So let me explain what happens now. It's so weird to be doing this without Annie or Matt. At any rate, What's going to happen now is we are going to segue into the after party. What that means is we will stop recording what we are doing so that we can be a little freer and easier in our conversation, talk about whatever it is we want to talk about based on what we just said or on something else. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party momentarily. If you are watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and you need to join us at ncheteach.org/conversations. You need to go there and again, go to that link and poof, you'll be part of the after party too. I want to thank everyone someone just got bingo when I said poof. If you're new here, I'm telling you, there are certain things I say every week, and contingency and poof are two of those things. And partner in crime, that's another one. At any rate, thank you all, as I say every Friday, thank you all for coming here on a Friday morning to discuss the current moment and the way in which it relates to history. Being here and talking this way and asking questions and engaging in a conversation with people who don't always agree necessarily with you. That's democracy in action. I want to thank all of you for basically taking part in the democratic process on a Friday morning. It matters. It matters enormously. As I said before, it has mattered to me personally in a big way, given pandemic times that we live in. This community is an amazing community, but it matters beyond us. That this happens, that it can happen, and that we've been doing it for 132 weeks. In times that often appear kind of dark, it's nice to know that these kinds of conversations, these kinds of questions, this kind of responsible wondering and interrogating of what's going on now is happening, consistently happens in such a wonderful community-minded climate. So thank you all. We will be back next week and I will come up with some new topic, maybe based on the news, since something new happens about every nanosecond of shocking value, who knows. But at any rate, thank you guys for coming. Have a good week. If you're not sticking around for the after party, if you are sticking around for the after party, let's head into the after party.